Alright, let's talk about Wilkie Collins, one of the most fascinating and influential writers of the Victorian era. Full name William Wilkie Collins. He was an English novelist, dramatist, and journalist, best known as a pioneer of sensation fiction and as one of the founders of detective literature. Both of those labels, sensation novelist and pioneer of detective fiction, have been asked in exam. Collins was born in London in 1824. His father was a famous painter, and you can really sense that visual imagination in his novels, the way he paints suspense scene by scene. He started his career dabbling in journalism and playwriting before turning to fiction. His first novel, Antonina, or The Fall of Rome, came out in 1850, then followed Basil in 1852, remember that one? It's often asked in exam. But his fame truly exploded with two masterpieces, The Woman in White in 1860 and The Moonstone in 1868. Both are considered landmarks in English prose, one in sensation fiction, the other in detective fiction. Let's start with The Woman in White, published in 1860 but written a year earlier and set between 1849 and 1850. That time frame has been asked in exam. It's a haunting mystery and a classic sensation novel. The story begins with Walter Hartwright, a drawing master, who encounters a mysterious woman dressed all in white on a lonely London road at night. That first encounter, the woman in white herself, is one of the most famous openings in Victorian fiction, and it's been asked in exam. Walter later travels to Limeridge House to teach two young women, Laura Fairley and her half-sister Marion Halcombe. Walter and Laura fall in love, but Laura is already engaged to the deceitful Sir Percival Glyde. Another figure, Count Fosco, joins Percival in plotting for Laura's fortune. Here's where it gets thrilling. The mysterious woman in white named Anne Catherick warns Walter and Marion about Glyde's dark secret. But the villains manage to trap Laura and send her to an asylum, pretending she's Anne instead. Walter and Marion eventually uncover Glyde's forged documents. That discovery has been asked in exam, and Glyde dies while trying to destroy the evidence of his illegitimacy. In the end, Walter and Laura marry, restoring justice and identity. Now, The Woman in White created an entirely new genre, the sensation novel, where domestic life, crime, and psychological suspense all blend together. It was serialized, dramatic, and deeply emotional, everything Victorian readers adored. 8 years later came The Moonstone in 1868, often called the first true English detective novel, and yes, that phrase is a guaranteed exam question. The story centers around a sacred diamond from India, known as the Moonstone, a symbol of colonial greed and superstition. The diamond is given as a birthday gift to Rachel Verinder, but it vanishes the very same night. A professional detective named Sergeant Cuff investigates the case, suspecting everyone in the household. Suspicion falls on Rachel's servant, Rosanna Spearman, and even on Franklin Blake, the novel's romantic hero. Later, it's revealed that Franklin took the gem himself, but unknowingly, while under the influence of opium. That drugged theft twist has been asked in exam. The real villain turns out to be Godfrey Ablewhite, a respected philanthropist by day and a thief by night. Eventually, the Moonstone is traced to London, recovered and returned to India, completing its moral and symbolic circle. What makes the Moonstone so special is that it established many of the conventions of detective fiction: multiple narrators, red herrings, a professional investigator, and a final rational explanation of mystery. Both The Woman in White and The Moonstone explore moral corruption beneath respectable society, a hallmark of Victorian sensation fiction. They also show Collins' keen interest in greed, secrecy, and identity, wrapped inside stories that thrill, shock, and still feel modern today. So, if you ever get an exam question on Gothic or detective origins, remember this. The Castle of Otranto began Gothic fiction. The Woman in White began the sensation novel, and The Moonstone began the detective novel. Not bad for one writer, right? Wilkie Collins truly shaped the modern mystery long before Sherlock Holmes ever stepped into Baker Street. Alright, let's travel into the heart of Victorian England and talk about two fascinating writers, Charles Kingsley and R.D. Blackmore, both deeply connected with history, morality, and the English countryside. Let's start with Charles Kingsley, who was born in Devonshire in 1810, a true man of the West Country, raised among the rugged beauty of Holne and Clovelly. He later studied at Oxford, completing his degree in 1842, and soon after took holy orders, becoming a clergyman. But Kingsley was far more than that. He was a preacher, historian, novelist, poet, and reformer. His first novel was Yeast, published in Fraser's Magazine in 1848, and later as a book in 1851. That date has been asked in exam. The title might sound odd, but it's symbolic. Yeast represents the ferment of social change bubbling up in England at the time. His next novel, Alton Locke, 1850, made him famous. It tells the story of a tailor poet who rebels against the injustices of factory life and becomes involved in the Chartist movement, another key exam point. The novel's aim was to stir sympathy for the working classes, and it even includes Thomas Carlyle as one of its characters. That crossover of real and fictional figures has also been asked in exam. Then comes Kingsley's most celebrated work of historical fiction, Westward Ho, 1855. This one is pure adventure, full of sea voyages, battles, and Elizabethan patriotism. It's a proudly imperialist novel and distinctly anti-Roman Catholic, reflecting Victorian attitudes of empire and Protestant virtue. He followed that with Hypatia, 1853, set in early Christian Egypt, a novel that shocked many readers with its sensual, almost erotic undertones beneath its religious debates. And later, he wrote Hereward the Wake, 1866, a story of the Norman conquest, celebrating the courage of the last Anglo-Saxon hero resisting Norman rule. Kingsley also wrote one of the most famous children's fantasies of the Victorian age, The Water Babies, 1863. This moral fable follows a chimney sweep who drowns and is reborn as a water baby in a world of underwater adventures. It's full of social criticism disguised as fantasy, and it's been repeatedly asked in exam. He was also a poet known for ballads like Airlie Beacon, The Sands of Dee, and Young and Old. His writing always carried a moral message, mixing faith, reform, and adventure in that classic Victorian style. Now, let's move to R.D. Blackmore, another Devonshire voice, born in 1825. He is best remembered for one major work, Lorna Doone, 1869, a historical romance that has earned a lasting place among English classics. The novel is set in the wilds of Exmoor in northern Devonshire during the late 17th century. Both those details have been asked in exam. It tells the story of John Ridd, a brave yeoman farmer, and his long, complicated love for Lorna Doone, a noble young woman raised among outlaws. The book beautifully blends action, romance, and local color, painting the moors of Devon and Somerset with deep affection. Blackmore's writing style was lush and descriptive, rooted in the landscape and folklore of rural England. In fact, Lorna Doone has often been compared to Scott's historical romances, combining adventure with a pastoral tenderness that made it timeless. Alright, let's dive into the life and works of George Meredith, one of the most complex yet rewarding figures of Victorian literature. He is often remembered as both a novelist and poet, but his real strength lies in his deep psychological insight, the way he probes pride, ego, and self-deception. Meredith was born in 1828 and lived well into the 20th century. His best-known novels are The Ordeal of Richard Feverel from 1859 and The Egoist from 1879, both of which have been asked in exam. Now, before these major works, Meredith experimented with storytelling in The Shaving of Sharkpath, 1856, and Farina, 1857, both fantasy-influenced and not widely read today. But then came The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, a history of father and son, the novel that established his reputation. Let's look closer at that one. The Ordeal of Richard Feverel tells the story of a father, Sir Austin Feverel, who tries to raise his son through a rigid scientific system he calls the system. His experiment in perfect upbringing fails miserably when Richard, his son, falls in love with Lucy, a farmer's niece. Their genuine affection clashes with Sir Austen's cold theories, leading to family conflict, heartbreak, and tragedy. The novel explores emotional repression, education, and free will, and yes, Richard's love for Lucy and Sir Austen's strictness have both been asked in exam. Meredith followed this with Evan Harrington in 1861, a delightful comedy of manners centered on class pretensions that title too has been asked in exam. Then came Emilia in England, later retitled Sandra Belloni, Rhoda Fleming, and Victoria, each exploring the relationship between idealism and human weakness. One of his most charming works is The Adventures of Harry Richmond, 1871. It's part adventure, part romance, and strongly autobiographical in sections. The novel follows Harry's journey across Europe, shaped by his complicated relationship with his eccentric father. His quest for love and identity mirrors Meredith's favorite themes: class, self-discovery, and emotional growth. And then, The Egoist, perhaps Meredith's masterpiece. It's a brilliant comedy of manners that skewers vanity and selfishness in society. The story centers on Sir Willoughby Patterne, a wealthy man who sees himself as the perfect gentleman except he's really the ultimate narcissist. He first proposes to Constantia Durham, but she abandons him. Humiliated, he quickly turns to Clara Middleton, who at first seems the perfect match. But as the engagement progresses, Clara realizes she's trapped by his controlling, self-centered nature. The real drama lies in Clara's internal struggle, her need to break free from social and emotional confinement. And of course, she finally finds the courage to end the engagement. The Egoist is both witty and psychological. It exposes the tyranny of ego in relationships. All the key details, Sir Willoughby's vanity, Constantia's escape, and Clara's disillusionment, have been asked in exam. Later, Meredith's Diana of the Crossways 1885 gave him new acclaim. It tells the story of Diana Warwick, an intelligent and independent woman trapped in an unhappy marriage. The novel explores love, betrayal, and the limits society places on women, and yes, those themes of female autonomy and social criticism have been asked in exam. Diana becomes the subject of scandal after she sells political secrets, an event inspired by the real-life case of Caroline Norton, a writer whose personal life was ruined by gossip and patriarchal law. Through Diana, Meredith critiques how Victorian society punished intelligent, outspoken women for daring to live freely. His other novels include Beauchamp's Career, The Tragic Comedians, and One of Our Conquerors, all filled with the same sharp moral and psychological observation. George Meredith's writing isn't always easy. His prose can be dense and ironic, but his characters feel strikingly modern. He bridges the Victorian world of moral seriousness with the early modern world of psychological realism. When you think of Meredith, remember these three touchstones for exam prep: The Ordeal of Richard Feverel, Father versus Son, Love versus Repression; The Egoist, The Anatomy of Selfishness and Social Hypocrisy; Diana of the Crossways, Independence, Intelligence, and the Tragedy of Reputation. Meredith lived until 1909, admired by later writers like Virginia Woolf and George Eliot. In fact, Woolf once said his characters are spiritual athletes always wrestling with conscience and emotion. So, George Meredith stands as a novelist of moral intelligence, a man who dissected pride, ego, and the human heart with rare precision. All right, let's step into the curious and wonderfully topsy-turvy world of Lewis Carroll, one of the most imaginative writers in English literature. Now, here's a quick fact that's often asked in exam. Lewis Carroll was actually a pen name. His real name was Charles Lutwidge Dodgson, and he lived from 1832 to 1898. He was not just a writer, but also a mathematician, a logician, and a photographer. That blend of logic and imagination runs right through his writing. Carroll is, of course, best known for his two timeless masterpieces, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland 1865 and its sequel, Through the Looking Glass 1871. Both have been asked in exam multiple times, so make sure those dates stick in your memory. Let's start with Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. The story begins when Alice follows a white rabbit down a rabbit hole and tumbles into a world where logic is turned upside down, talking animals, mad tea parties, and a very bossy Queen of Hearts. It's a perfect example of the literary nonsense genre, where language and reason are playfully twisted to spark both confusion and delight. 6 years later, Carroll returned with Through the Looking Glass and What Alice Found There. This time, Alice steps through a mirror into another strange world, one structured like a giant chessboard. She becomes a pawn in a life-size chess game, meets memorable characters like Tweedledum and Tweedledee, and, by the end, reaches the final square to become a queen. The entire story feels like a dream within a dream, familiar yet fantastically distorted. Inside this sequel, Carroll included two of his most famous poems, Jabberwocky and The Walrus and the Carpenter. Now, Jabberwocky is especially important because it's a landmark in literary nonsense. That's been asked in exam many times. The poem tells the story of a young hero warned about a terrifying creature, the Jabberwock. He sets out, sword in hand, to slay it, meeting other bizarre creatures like the Jubjub bird along the way. Despite its nonsensical language, it somehow paints a vivid picture, which is exactly what makes Carroll a genius of imagination. Beyond the Alice books, Carroll wrote several other fascinating works. There's The Hunting of the Snark, 1876, a long nonsense poem about an impossible quest. Then Rhyme and Reason from 1883, which revisits some earlier poems like Phantasmagoria. He also wrote A Tangled Tale, 1885, a clever mix of logic puzzles and humor, and Sylvie and Bruno in 1889, followed by its sequel, Sylvie and Bruno, concluded in 1893. These were attempts to blend fantasy and social realism, though they never reached the fame of Alice. He even produced versions for younger readers like The Nursery Alice in 1890 and philosophical pieces such as What the Tortoise Said to Achilles, 1895, which plays with paradoxes, something only a mathematician like Carroll could pull off with such wit. And one last detail, Carroll's poetry collection, Three Sunsets and Other Poems, was published in 1898, the same year he passed away. So to sum him up, Lewis Carroll created a universe where logic dances with nonsense, where everyday reason collapses into dreamlike absurdity, yet everything feels strangely true. His Alice books changed the shape of children's literature, influencing fantasy writers from C.S. Lewis to J.K. Rowling. And remember this for your exam. Real name, Charles Lutwidge Dodgson. Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. Through the Looking Glass includes Jabberwocky, The Hunting of the Snark, and Sylvie and Bruno. A mathematician by trade and a dreamer by heart, Carroll gave us stories that remind us that imagination is not chaos, it's another kind of logic entirely. Alright, let's dive into two fascinating writers who bridged the late Victorian world with the beginnings of modern thought, Samuel Butler and Robert Louis Stevenson. Let's start with Samuel Butler. He was an English novelist, essayist and critic, a sharp observer of human behavior who loved challenging social conventions. His first big success came with Erewhon, published in 1872, and yes, that title has been asked in exam. The full name is Erewhon, or Over the Range, a satirical novel about a fictional land where everything is just slightly upside down. In Erewhon, illness is actually treated as a crime, while crime itself is viewed as a kind of disease. That idea, illness as crime, has been asked multiple times in exam. And here's another quirky twist. The Erewhonians fear that machines might one day take over, so they ban technology altogether. Butler uses these strange customs to poke fun at Victorian society, its moral pretensions, and its blind faith in progress. It's satire, philosophy, and science fiction all rolled into one. He even returned to that world nearly 30 years later in Erewhon Revisited 1901. Along the way, Butler also wrote essays like Luck or Cunning as the main means of organic modification, where he questioned Darwin's theories and explored how chance and instinct might shape life. But Butler's most famous book is The Way of All Flesh, published posthumously in 1903, again an important exam year. It's an autobiographical novel that follows the Pontifex family, particularly Ernest Pontifex, who struggles against a repressive upbringing and hypocritical religion. Ernest's grandfather John is a carpenter. Yes, that's another exam detail. And through 4 generations, Butler explores Victorian values, family control, and the painful journey towards self-understanding. Ernest eventually breaks free and finds peace, symbolizing the search for personal identity in a world obsessed with respectability. He also wrote works like God the Known and God the Unknown and A First Year in Canterbury Settlement. But it's Erewhon and The Way of All Flesh that truly cement Butler's legacy, both brilliant critiques of society's hypocrisy. Now, let's move to Robert Louis Stevenson, born in 1850, just a generation later, but stylistically very different. Stevenson was Scottish novelist, essayist, poet, and a traveler at heart. His works combine adventure, psychology, and moral complexity, and several of them are regular exam favorites. His breakout work was Treasure Island, published in 1883, a classic adventure novel that has thrilled readers ever since. Originally titled The Sea Cook, A Story for Boys. Yes, that title change has been asked in exam. It tells the story of young Jim Hawkins, who finds a pirate map in an inn and sets out to find buried treasure. They sail aboard the Hispaniola, led by Captain Smollett, but the ship hides a secret. Among the crew is Long John Silver, a one-legged cook who plans to seize the treasure for himself. Jim overhears the mutiny, faces countless dangers, and eventually foils Silver's plan, all of which have been asked in exam. In the end, they recover part of the treasure and return home, though Silver slips away, leaving behind one of the most memorable pirates in literature. Then came one of the defining Gothic novellas of the century, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, published in 1886. It's a masterclass in psychological horror. The story follows Gabriel John Utterson, a London lawyer who investigates the mysterious link between the respectable Dr. Henry Jekyll and the violent Mr. Edward Hyde. The truth, of course, is that Jekyll has created a potion that transforms him into Hyde, his dark, repressed alter ego. It's a Gothic exploration of human duality, where good and evil battle within the same soul. That transformation and Jekyll's tragic loss of control has been asked in exam more times than any other detail. Stevenson's career didn't stop there. He wrote Prince Otto, 1885, Kidnapped, 1886, The Black Arrow, 1888, a historical romance set during the Wars of the Roses and The Master of Ballantrae, 1889, a sweeping tale of rivalry and revenge across Scotland, America, and India. He also co-wrote darkly comic tales like The Wrong Box and The Ebb Tide. And for a softer side, he gave us A Child's Garden of Verses, poems that capture the innocence of childhood, still beloved today. Stevenson's writing is fast-paced yet moral, entertaining yet introspective. He combines the excitement of adventure with the unease of inner darkness, making him both a romantic at heart and a pioneer of modern psychological fiction. Let's begin with Jerome K. Jerome, one of the wittiest and most light-hearted voices in late Victorian literature. Jerome Klapka, Jerome, quite a memorable name, isn't it? Was an English novelist, essayist, and playwright, born in 1859. He left school at just 14 and took up a series of jobs, first as a railway clerk, then a teacher, an actor, and finally a journalist. All those early struggles and observations of ordinary people later shaped his writing. His first book, On the Stage and Off, came out in 1885, and that title has been asked in exam. It humorously recorded his experiences as a struggling actor, but the next year he published The Idle Thoughts of an Idle Fellow, another exam favorite, which made him instantly popular. In it, Jerome reflects with gentle irony on everyday life, laziness, and human folly, all wrapped in a tone that's witty yet relatable. Then came his masterpiece, Three Men in a Boat, to say nothing of The Dog, published in 1889, and yes, the full title has been asked in exam. The story follows three friends, Jay, George, and Harris, and their dog, Montmorency, as they set off on a boating holiday along the River Thames. They're looking for peace and a break from the stress of city life. But what they find instead is one comic disaster after another, mispacking, confusing maps, bad weather, and endless mishaps in cooking and camping. But here's the beauty. Beneath the humor, Jerome gives us tender reflections on friendship, nature, and the simple joys of life. The novel paints a vivid picture of the English countryside while gently poking fun at human vanity and incompetence. And of course, Montmorency the dog has become one of the most beloved comic pets in English literature. Later, Jerome followed up with Three Men on the Bummel in 1900, another travel comedy featuring the same trio, this time cycling through Germany. He also wrote Paul Kelver in 1902, an autobiographical novel that gives a more personal glimpse into his life. Near the end of his career, he published his memoir, My Life and Times, in 1926, just a year before his death in 1927. Jerome's humor was never cruel or cynical. It was affectionate, observational, and deeply human. That's why his work remains such a delight, especially for readers who enjoy the lighter side of English prose. Now let's turn to Sir James Matthew Barrie, a writer whose imagination gave us one of the most magical characters in all of literature, Peter Pan. Barrie was a Scottish novelist and playwright born in 1860 in Kirriemuir, Scotland, and that birthplace often appears in exam questions. After completing his education in Scotland, he moved to London, where he began writing novels and plays that often celebrated small-town life and childhood imagination. But everything changed when Barrie met the Llewellyn Davies boys, who inspired his tales about a magical boy who could fly and never grew up. The earliest version of Peter Pan appeared in his novel The Little White Bird in 1902, where Peter is depicted as a baby who lives in Kensington Gardens. That detail, the magical baby in Kensington Gardens, has been asked in exam. Barrie then expanded the idea into his most famous creation, the play Peter Pan, or The Boy Who Would Not Grow Up, first staged in 1904. In the play, Peter Pan visits the darling children, Wendy, John, and Michael in London. He teaches them to fly, and together they journey to Neverland, a fantasy island filled with fairies, mermaids, lost boys, and the villainous Captain Hook. It's in Neverland that we see Barrie's genius, a perfect blend of adventure, innocence, humor, and melancholy. Peter fights pirates, rescues friends, and remains forever young, while the darlings eventually return home, leaving Peter behind, still frozen in his eternal childhood. Through Peter Pan, Barrie explores a hauntingly beautiful idea, the dream of never growing up, of living forever in imagination. Yet, beneath the wonder, there's sadness too, the cost of escaping reality. Barrie was knighted for his contribution to literature and became one of the most beloved figures of his time. When he passed away in 1937, he left behind a legacy that continues to enchant readers and audiences across the world. So, in summary, Jerome K. Jerome gave English literature laughter, warmth, and Three Men in a Boat. J. M. Barrie gave it magic, innocence, and Peter Pan. One celebrated the humor of life's chaos. The other captured the wistful dream of never growing up, both unforgettable voices in late Victorian and early modern literature.